Hey everybody, and welcome back to another book review. So this book, I was told to read a very, very, very long time ago. Probably closer to like when it actually came out. And then there was a movie that came out, and everybody was like raving about the movie if they hadn't read the book, but if they had read the book, they were really upset about the movie. So I finally got around to reading it, and that is The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. And it's a good book, you know. I give it I give it a 5 out of 5 for just telling a story that I think, especially within the Black community, we hear far too often. And if I have a complaint about it, it is that, you know, it's a stereotypical story, a little bit, but at the same time, I really like how the story kind of gets woven together, and it's not just one facet of the story. But it is very similar to a lot of the stories that we hear about. Think of other books that I've, pardon me, read, like Dear Justice or Dear Martin. It's in that same vein. It all makes sense together. But so for those of you that don't know, The Hate You Give is a story about a girl named Star, and she is, this is the second time in her very young life. She's only 16, I think, when the story starts. But it's the second time that she experiences the loss of a friend through gun violence in front of her. So the first time, she loses her best friend. I think her name was Natasha or something like that. And that happens in a drive-by. They live in kind of a turf war area. And then the second time, and so she was 10 when that happened. And then this time she's 16 and she loses her other best friend. They were part of like a trio. And she loses him to a police-involved shooting. And the story is not just, you know, the story about Star and her friends and stuff, but it's also highlighting a lot of different facets that I think several of us in the Black community have experienced. One, obviously, gun violence. Two, police profiling. And then three, the idea that you kind of have to hide yourself, especially if you go to a different school. It's not your neighborhood school. Or if you live in the burbs or things like that. And so I know I've talked about it before, because that totally has been my experience. I lived for the first part of my life in an area that would be more considered the hood now. And actually, I was just talking with some of my coworkers about when they were in high school, and they were like, "Oh yeah, you know, I went to this school," and I was like, "If my parents hadn't decided to put me in the small Catholic school that was in the same neighborhood, I would have been in high school with y'all," you know, and we were all kind of joking about that, and, you know, just about where we grew up and how that kind of changed our trajectories and things like that. But because I was moved to the burbs, I had a slightly different ending to my academic career. And I was given, I feel like, more opportunities to do things than I think some of my friends and coworkers who stayed in that area, and you know, feeling guilty about that. I think the character Star really kind of highlights that. She feels guilty that her family has worked really hard to get her and her siblings out of the area that they're in to a really good school, but they don't move, and that's something that I think is an interesting conversation. That part of the reason they don't move from the neighborhood, but they still drive really far to the school, is that their dad, who is a member of one of the major gangs, he is a felon. He was in jail and prison for a very long time, and then when he gets out, he can't get a job, and the only job he can get is at the local kind of corner store, grocery store. And it's kind of the only store that's on that side of town, unless you want to drive all the way over and go into Walmart, which a lot of the older folks and the elderly don't want to do. And so that is part of the reason that he wants to stay in the neighborhood, because he's like, I'm doing something good. I'm fixing up the store. I'm helping people who need actual help. And there's this conversation about like, hey, we should move out of the neighborhood because, this is not safe for our kids. There's, drive-bys and all this stuff that are happening. And this is the second time your child specifically has seen one of their friends die. And then on the other side of, Star has her friends in the neighborhood that understand that and that she could talk to about that, or people in her family, but she doesn't want to. And then when she goes to school, she also can't talk about it because, her friends wouldn't understand. They are predominantly white. She does have one friend who's Asian, I think. And then that becomes a conversation about, like, hey, one of our friends that's in our little trio that we have here at school is racist, basically. And so that becomes, another topic of conversation. She won't share her experience with them, but because of that, this person keeps making all of these, racist comments and things like that. It's just a very interesting story, and, really highlights a lot of what I personally have experienced, at least from an education side of, people thinking you're to this or you're to that, learning code switching and all those things. And so that's really nice to again see that kind of representation in the book. But like I said, this is like the fourth or fifth book that I've read that's kind of in this same vein, and I do think that there is purpose in it, but I would also like to see, a few more books that don't necessarily have to hinge on, gun violence in the Black community. While I know that that is very prevalent and very important, I don't think that it's just what defines us or what makes, our youth turn and become activists and things like that. I do love, though, in the story at the end, there because of this police brutality, the police officer is not convicted. The grand jury decides not to indict and all that. There's several protests, there's several riots, and the kids talk about the fact that they were like actually there, and they're like, this isn't fair, and they're just using their voices. They're meeting peacefully, but then one person goes and is like, I'm going to loot this thing, and it turns everything into mayhem. And so instead of it being this powerful protest, it becomes, like this, you're rioting, which I think is a lot of people's issues and complaints with protests, is that they're like, it's a riot. And understanding that it's almost never that. It's always, just a handful of people that do so under the guise of this protest that typically is peaceful. And so that's something that like I've argued with people about, and part of the reason that people really struggle with the BLM and other activist groups is that they're like, oh, they're just rioting. They're just pillaging and plundering and doing all that stuff. And we're trying to explain that that was not the intent. That was not the purpose. Like, it was simply marching. It was simply using your voice in power, using the experiences that you've had, being profiled and things like that. And then I think the last thing, and of course, most everybody knows, but Star is also struggling with the concept that she's dating a white boy, and totally get that, being married to one, and she's trying to figure out, how to tell her family, and then her family like slowly figures it out anyway. Most of that happens before the story starts, but her dad still doesn't know. And for me, I've never really had that conversation about, should you date white, should you date Black, should you date whatever. I think my family, I don't know if they actually ever said anything. But I think my family has always just kind of been like, your friends are your friends. And, if that leads to something else, cool, great. But it was never really a problem. But it was a problem with a lot of other people, still a problem with a lot of other people, white and Black. different comments that have been made. And I was talking to my husband, this was years ago, about the fact that a lot of times those comments are never made to him, they're made to me, as if I'm the one that can, bear it or whatever. And so, I understand a lot of what Star is going through because I've gone through the exact same things. But yeah, it's a really good book. I'm really glad it's written. It is definitely a book that is a little bit of a harder read because it's darker, not because it's a hard read. I actually read this in one day. It's a very, very easy read. I would argue that it's probably written on a 6th or 7th grade level. So very, very easy to read. But it's hard to read because of, the topics and how it makes people feel, and also how it highlights, I think, for a lot of people, things that their friends are doing or not doing, and what their friends are saying. What's okay and what's not okay. Again, I've definitely experienced a lot of that. I'm more so experienced, I think, in high school and college, which is, where Star's at, of just people making comments and things like that. And they're like, oh, it's a joke. But like, when you really sit there and think about it, you're like, it's actually not a joke. It's actually racist. Like one of her supposed best friend, Haley, like asked their Asian friend Maya, who had gone to visit her family in Taipei, and was like, oh, so you guys ate cat for Thanksgiving or whatever. And she was like, oh, it's a joke. And they bring it up, years later, and they're like, but it wasn't a joke. And she's like, you guys can't take a joke. And they're like, but it's not a joke. It's not a joke. You literally asked if my family eats cat. And things like that. And so I've definitely been on the receiving end of that, not so much about, what we eat, but, obviously fried chicken comments, big butt comments, which I don't anymore. But like back in the day when I was still working out a lot because I was so skinny, my butt was definitely very, much more, protruding, and stuff. So, just thinking about those kind of things, and those kind of comments and experiences and stuff, like really hit home for me. So long story long, really like this book. I think it's a great book, especially if you're into more reading like that. There's a lot in there about old school rap and bringing up songs, and like every time a song was brought up, I was like immediately saying it. Lots of Tupac, lots of NWA, especially at the end, F the police and all that stuff that like became kind of their mantra and stuff. And I was like, yep, like all of those things. So, and then, this book, I believe, was written, probably in 2016, maybe, but published in 2017. Yeah, copyright is 2017. So, so there were a lot of names that had already started making those, various lists, Trayvon Martin and all that. And so at the end of the book, it does have that list. But then, as we know, it's 2025 now. So that list has gotten longer. And so, it was interesting as I was reading the latter part where they're going through the names and stuff. And I instinctively added all the other names. It's just one of those things that, never really goes away and does, overall impact you long term. So yeah, there you have it. As always, thank you so much for watching. Did I say it was a 5 out of 5? 5 out of 5. But thank you so much for watching. Like, comment, share, subscribe if you so choose. Those of you that came over from my husband's channel, welcome. Here we do books, not video games. But if you have any book suggestions, feel free to drop them in the comments. Another great book suggestion from a friend of mine, coworker and everything. She's been the one that has been suggesting a lot of books that I've been reading lately, and I told her I'm not taking no more book suggestions from her because it usually makes me angry. This one didn't make me super angry, just because I've lived it. So, but some of the other books, I'm like, you don't get no more book suggestions. So yeah. But if you have any, feel free to drop them in the comments, and I will see you in the next book review. Bye.